Hi everyone, my name is Noel Clark, and for my CBSL project, I'm working with a local nonprofit called the BRAD Foundation. It was created in the honor of the life of Brad Parker, a man who died while rock climbing in Yosemite. Brad's friends and family members joined together in the wake of his death and created the foundation so that they could continue spreading his positive outlook and his belief in the next generation. Brad's good friend, Jerry Dodgeville, once said of him, "You meet a lot of people in the course of life, but every now and then you meet someone who is a special being." He was one of those people. When I first heard this statement, I was struck with an interesting question. Why do some people we meet leave such lasting effects on us even after they die? In search for an answer, I began looking at cultures with strong ties to death and the dying, and this led me to the Tanya Tarajan culture. In a TED Talk entitled "Life That Doesn't End in Death," I learned that funerals in the Tarajan culture are more a cause for celebration than for mourning. Tanya Tarajans are a group of indigenous people living in Sulawesi, Indonesia, and because of their belief that death isn't simply an end and that life continues on in another stage, they are able to view funerals as a celebration of the past loved one's life and the impacts that they had on those around them. An interesting story that I heard in this TED Talk was of a woman who died and whose funeral was held 20 years later. She resided in her home until this time and was symbolically fed and cared for by her children and grandchildren until they could accrue enough resources to put on a funeral they felt was fitting for her. This may seem like a rare occurrence in our culture, but in the Tarajan culture, it is seen as entirely respectful and highly commonplace. And this reflects the belief that death isn't an end to a relationship, but merely a transformation of its nature. This belief is further reflected in the presence of the Tongkonan, or the traditional ancestral homes of the Tarajan people. These beautifully decorated homes function as the center of life and house the deceased loved ones. When I realized the Tanya Tarajan's great acceptance of death and the dying, I began looking at Western culture's view and how it was so vastly different from the Tanya Tarajans. When I first thought about grief, I thought about the 5-step grieving process. This is a process that includes denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. When I first thought about it, I thought it was a great way to simplify the stages of grief for those who may be experiencing a hard loss. But later I learned that it can actually function to isolate those who aren't feeling grief in the same way. In the book, The Other Side of Sadness, by bereavement psychologist George A. Bonanno, I heard a story of a woman who lost her daughter in the events of 9/11. She returned to work nearly a week later, and her friends and family members were concerned that she was caught up in the denial stage of her grief. They couldn't accept that her experience of grief was different from their own experience. Another thing I learned from this same book is that more often than not, we show signs of resilience shortly after experiencing a hard loss, and this goes entirely against the thinking of the 5-step grieving process. I came to the conclusion that our process of grief should not be widely defined for individuals whose experiences of grief are as unique as their own experiences in life. I read a poem called Patterns by Amy Lowell, which reflects this same thinking. Patterns is about a woman who lost her soon-to-be husband to war and is now caught up in following the patterns of grief and being a pattern herself. She must display the correct signs of grief so that the love for her lost fiancé is not questioned. Instead of functioning to console her and give her a community of people to turn to, this instead makes her feel more isolated. She wears a stiff and lavish gown, decorated with jewels and embroidered in patterns, to cover up her grief-broken body. Reading this poem reminded me of the time that I met Brad Parker's fiancé about a year ago. He died on the day he proposed to her, and even 2 years later, I could still see the grief she felt when she talked about him, even though I could tell she was also very happy I had been positively affected by the BRAD Foundation. While I had never experienced a profound loss in my own life, merely thinking about losing those I love is enough to send me into fits of anxiety and makes me beg an answer to the question, how do they go on? The answer is, they don't, at least not in the same way. I watched the film Manchester by the Sea, in which the protagonist's brother dies, and he is now charged with the task of being his nephew's legal guardian. The film portrays their relationships and the unique experiences they have with their grief. It ends in medias res, or in the midst of things, and I think this speaks volumes unto the very nature of bereavement and resilience. Our hearts continue to beat, even if they do so painfully. While I had read literature and watched film on the human characteristic of resilience, I'd never felt it personally in my own life, and so I wanted more depth on the topic. I went in to talk to Mr. Sharfin about his opinion of resilience, and what I didn't know is that recently he had just lost a very dear friend, and he told me he could still feel the presence of this friend in his life, and thought this was an example of resilience working in his life. He defined resilience as the deeper understanding that death isn't simply a meaningless end. I don't know about you all, but this to me sounds a little bit like the Tanya Tarajan belief. Comparing it to the idea of birth as a death to one stage in life, Mr. Sharfin said that the death we are accustomed to might just be the end of the developmental process of our spirits. Just as we need 9 months in the womb for our cells to develop and our bodies to take form, maybe our years here on this earth are a developmental process for the formation and maturation of our spiritual selves. Part of the reason we fear death so much is that we never think about it for longer than just in passing. We are so caught up in progressing in our daily lives, we don't give ourselves time to stop and think about the deeper existential questions like, why am I here, and what is my purpose in this life? The death of a loved one, however, gives us a jolt and awakens us to these questions and where we stand on them. My challenge for all of you is to not wait for the death of a loved one to change something about your relationships or your life, and to remember that you are more resilient than you may think. Thank you.